and welcome to Booklist. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is first-time novelist SM Hulse. Sarah, thank you so much for driving over from Spokane today, braving the passes.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to our talk because I wanted to know how your first novel, Black River, came about. You have an MFA.
I do, and
where did you get your MFA?
University of Oregon. And I went in knowing I wanted to write a novel, which is kind of not always encouraged in MFA programs. I think generally that's the end goal for a lot of people, but they're difficult to workshop in most situations. So what I ended up doing was writing Black River as my thesis, while also doing short stories to take to workshop.
And did you use the same characters? I mean, did you make use of the short stories that you were writing to kind of do background of the characters or do stuff that would eventually help you in the writing of the novel?
It certainly helped me. The characters and the settings were not really the same. I did write one story that was set in Montana that was my first published story. But I certainly learned a lot, particularly in terms of prose and structure. I think writing the short stories really helped me think kind of about those types of issues, and even though it's a much different situation in a novel, those skills carried over in a way that I think would have been more helpful than just submitting a few chapters at a time, where a lot of questions in my experience kind of end up being about plot issues that you may have resolved in the next chapter they haven't seen yet.
Right, right. Did you grow up wanting to be a writer?
To some extent, yes. I wanted to be a lot of things, but my father's a journalist, my mother's an English teacher, so there were many, many books in my house. My mother started writing down my stories when I was a little girl, and hopefully no one will ever see them, because I was very fond of writing stories about inanimate objects like lamps. Household appliances, so I've become somewhat more sophisticated over time. But I really enjoyed writing, and I did all the way through school. I didn't think I was going to pursue it at sort of a college and grad school level at first. I went to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University for a semester. And even though I still have a lot of interest in that kind of thing, I sort of realized while I was there that I was more interested in the people behind foreign policy, or the people, the stories that were kind of behind what we were seeing in the news and what was turning up on those statistics and those charts that you started studying. So when I transferred to the University of Montana, I did become an English major, and although I became an English teacher and focused on that in school, I had the opportunity to take some writing classes there, which I enjoyed.
Were the books that you liked as an adult, were they books that were character-driven novels, or were they other?
I think for the most part, yes. I like a lot of books. When people come into my house, I have sort of, I think, the literary fiction and the Western fiction they'd expect, but I also have a fair bit of genre fiction, nonfiction. And so, I definitely like a lot of the Kent Harif and Annie Proulx and Mark Spragg and all of those. Thomas Savage is kind of a personal favorite that I discovered fairly late fairly recently, I should say. But
you need to read his wife's book about Montana, The Girls from the Five Great Valleys.
That's what I've heard,
which is set in Missoula in the 1930s.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, it's a wonderful novel. So you wrote Black River as your senior thesis when you were getting your MFA. And then what happened after that? Because everybody's first question when somebody publishes a novel, one of the first questions is, how did you get an agent? That kind of thing.
Well, I have kind of a funny story about my agent, Lauren Reese, who's based in Boston. He had read my first published short story, which was in Willow Springs, and he called me, and I did not have a complete draft of Black River at the time, but he read what I had, and he actually offered me representation, and I turned him down after much agonizing and asking of opinions, simply because I felt like it was very important to me to know that whoever I signed with was comfortable with where I took the story. And he was kind of, I think, slightly put out, but was like, okay, and stayed in touch with me. And I was very lucky because I finished my MFA. I did 3 years. It's 2 years are standard at Oregon, and there's sometimes teaching positions for third-year students, and I was fortunate to get one of those. So I left with a completed first draft. And then I got a fiction fellowship at the University of Wisconsin, which was fantastic. It's designed for people to finish their first books. Perfect timing for me. I was able to finish revisions the first semester I was there. And I'd had a couple other agents contact me by that point who had read other short stories I'd published in literary journals. And several of them offered representation, and I ended up going back to Lauren because I still felt he really had a good understanding of where I wanted to take the book. And so I had, by that point, just on my own, cut 25,000 words from the first draft. And Lauren was like, I love this book. I think you need to cut 20,000 more. So I hung up the phone and, kind of stewed around and thought unkind thoughts toward my agent. And it turned out he was right because I went through and cut as much more as I could without paying attention to word count. And it ended up being about 18 or 19,000 more to this, which is about 80,000 altogether. So that was difficult, but I think important. And at that point, he sent it out to a number of publishers. And an editor at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, Jenna Johnson, was interested. And after we spoke on the phone, I knew I really wanted to work with her. Houghton Mifflin Harcourt has, I think, a great track record of publishing, Western literary fiction, especially by women. She had worked with Kent Myers, who I really admire, a South Dakota author. And she's also, in addition to the Western thing, she has a pretty strong interest in writing about religion and faith in fiction, which is something I have a very strong interest in as well. So that was, she'd also asked me that question, what else are you working on? And I was not prepared for this at all. So I kind of mumbled something about a story I was working on that maybe was too big to be a story. And my agent called me the next day and said, Jenna would like to buy Black River and also the other book you pitched. And all I could think was that what I did? Did I pitch a book? So that's the one I'm working on now.
And do you talk about it, or do you find that it's better to keep it all inside? I
don't much, simply because I change a lot of things, and I think people will be like, but what about the XYZ you told me about last time? And I won't even remember what they are talking about. But it's another, it's also set in northwestern Montana. It's another fictional town, but a different town, new characters. So I would say I'm certainly looking at some of the same kinds of issues. What I'm looking at now is my protagonist is a woman whose brother has become kind of caught up in some of the far right-wing things, politics that kind of pervade the West a little bit, and has set off a bomb at a government building. And so it kind of takes off from there. Again, me liking these sort of major events and then what happens after.
Right. So one of the issues I think book reviewers have to deal with is when they're describing a book. How does one describe a book to let readers know whether they want to read the book or not, but not so much that you're giving away major issues? How would you describe your book?
I consider it's the story of a 60-year-old retired corrections officer named Wes Carver. And as the book opens, his wife has dying of cancer, and she passes away very early on in the book. And so he goes back to his hometown, which is this fictional town of Black River in Montana. And the catalyst for that is, he's going to go scatter her ashes. This is her last wishes. But we very quickly realize he's going back for many other reasons, foremost of which is that he was involved in a prison riot. He was taken hostage 20 years before, and the inmate who took him hostage and treated him very poorly has come up for parole. And then once there, some family drama with the estranged stepson, who is an adult, lots of history there, very little of it good. And then I always forget the part where I say, and there's fiddle music.
Yeah, right.
So the music is a big part of this book, and the loss of music and the power of music.
To heal.
Yes.
And to kind of assuage the past.
Yes.
In a way, yeah. So the main character, through whom we experience the book mainly, except for those few chapters with his wife, which I thought was were just beautiful. I mean, here you are, you know, a 60-year-old man. You know, I bought it. I mean, I thought that it was because you write under SM Hulse, not saying that you're a woman and a young woman at that. There's no way of knowing that who you are unless somebody looks at the picture at the back of the book. But why did you choose to do it from that perspective?
Well, it does, you know, it's one of those things that I'm not sure it felt like a choice. He was, you know, I'd sort of had a couple of these characters maybe in a different form kind of kicking around in my head for a while. I was interested in a character like Wes and his stepson Dennis, who were at odds for reasons I hadn't quite figured out in my mind. And at first I was more interested in Dennis, the stepson, and then I very kind of quickly became interested in why would this older man be the way he is? Why is he so rigid? Why is he, you know, so set in his ways? Why can he not see sort of the damage he's doing with his good intentions in a way? And from that I kind of became interested in, you know, I love Western fiction and I love the West, and I think sort of the mythology around the West is very interesting, the sort of stereotypes and these archetypes. And to me, Wes is a little bit of that kind of classic Western man, you know,
silent,
stoic,
strong,
yeah, self-sufficient. I'm going to do it myself, and
overcoming pain, physical and emotional, from the past.
I think we generally admire that, but I was kind of interested in this book and seeing, well, what happens if you take that kind of person and put him in the real world? Some ways those traits are going to serve him well, and in some they're not. And putting him in a modern West where, you know, we do still have some of those holdovers of, I think, the kind of idea of the West and the historical West and the mythological West, but, you know, it's also a place where you have, you know, Walmarts and prisons and all these things that we have to have in contemporary society.
Right. I mean, it's a very, Wes is a very kind of macho, you know, a very macho character, and yet he's brought low by the death of his wife, whom he adores. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
And went through this kind of horrific experience during that prison riot. And that's a very painful part of the book to read, that experience which we share with Wes. How hard was that to write, and how much rewriting, if any, went into that part?
Well, mostly I tend to write long, as I kind of alluded to before, needing to cut out. And that was one of the challenging thing was, I think, maybe not so much the writing of it, because by the time I got to those scenes, I was really, you know, I really understood Wes well, and I had been thinking about, you know, how has this affected him in everything he's done to the book so far. And I mean, there's certainly uncomfortable scenes to write, but in a strange way, as a writer, anything that's, you know, very dramatic and kind of emotionally intense is sort of a good thing to write as well. I mean, as difficult as the subject matter may be, when you feel like you're getting it and it's working, it's sort of a satisfying thing as a writer. But I sometimes think that for him, it was just such a difficult situation that writing about it in the first draft, I went too far. And I just said, that's too much information. This is a guy who's not going to think about this as much as possible. And then it gets kind of tied up. You worry, you know, am I withholding too much from the reader for too long? Is it manipulative? But I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, particularly in conjunction with those few chapters that bring us Claire's perspective, which I didn't add until I was about 100 pages into the first draft and realized this guy, Wes, is not a character who's really giving anyone access to understand him. And that's why the bulk of the detail about the riot actually comes from Claire. And her experience of it and what she learned afterward and what he wouldn't tell her. And once I've kind of decided to do that and have these little snippets from Wes, when he, you know, when Wes tells us something about the riot, it's almost because he cannot suppress it any longer. Whereas the kind of nuts and bolts of what happened, Claire's willing to think about it.
The cover of the book is so evocative of Montana and that kind of beautiful big sky. And did you have And plus the white, which makes it
Which
look like an old photograph.
A few people have tried to return it because they thought it was used, which one sales rep said would happen, and he was right.
How funny.
It's the second cover that we looked at. There was one before that I thought was very beautiful, and it had a similar distressed effect that I liked a lot. And I think that some of the sales and marketing teams had hoped to maybe not do simply a Western landscape. But this one, I felt like it almost, it made great sense if you'd read the book. It had a man kind of walking through a field, but it kind of had the cowboy historical, maybe you left your prairie wife back at the ranch kind of thing, if you didn't know anything about the book.
Right.
And then, so we do have the Western landscape, but I really like it. I like the clouds above it. I love the effect. I'm very happy with the way it's turned out.
Now, why did you publish it under initials?
It was the suggestion of my publisher. It wasn't a new idea to me. I'd actually sent out a short story under my initials that was accepted. I just was indecisive and happened to have two stories accepted on the same day, one with Sarah, one with SM,
Wow.
so I went with Sarah at the time. And when my publisher suggested it, I was kind of two minds. There's the part of you that says, really, we still need to be concerned with gender-neutral names for women writing non-traditionally feminine, supposedly fiction.
With
male
protagonists, right.
But there's, the other part of me was thinking, I think I'm as guilty as anyone of the sort of subconscious snap judgments about maybe the cover of a book. This is why we spend so much time talking about covers and having these wonderful designers. And we're certainly not, hiding the fact that I'm a woman. I mean, if you flip to the back jacket, there's a picture of me. And I kind of viewed it as, well, if it gets someone to pick it up and look at the front flap who maybe wouldn't have, not because they had any overt prejudice, but because they might have just had that sort of subconscious, maybe this book isn't for me kind of thing, then, that's a step to maybe getting some readers who otherwise wouldn't have picked up the book, while still making it, pretty perfectly clear in interviews and on my website and all of that. Yes, a woman wrote the book. So I've had a few blog posts or Q&As where they've said, SM Hulse and his book, or one of the reviews did, and people are like, well, doesn't that make you angry? And I said, no, I just say, that means I was convincing writing the man. So.
Yeah, right. In a way, it's a compliment that they would do that. It is interesting that what you said about it not being a conscious prejudice, but yet there's still the author Molly Gloss, who writes about the West, and has very strong feelings about the women's role in the West. I think that it isn't it isn't conscious. It is kind of an unconscious and part of that mythos that comes to us from the settling of the West, and that we don't pay enough attention to what the women went through. And with your new book, are you more nervous about writing your new? Is it harder for you to write this new one?
I don't think it's. I mean, in some ways it's harder, in some ways it's easier, I suppose. In the sense that it's easier, you can do it, you've done it once.
Right.
And I'm fortunate in the sense that it was part of a 2-book deal. I know who will be editing it, I know who I'll be working with, I know they're supportive, and that's wonderful. The one thing is this was sort of, there's no deadline on your first one.
Right.
And it's not really a problem so much as something that you just never had to consider before. But in terms of the actual writing, it's really hasn't been too different. I still take a long time to think about it ahead of time before I get to write things down. But I make a lot of notes by hand, kind of as I write or before I write, for those things that pop into your head, or phrases you think you might want to put in later. And that process hasn't really changed. So not too much has changed. I mean, if anything, it's a little more streamlined because I'm not stopping every so often to write short stories for grad school, and that kind of thing. So.
Do you think you'll go back to short stories? I mean, do you ever think about doing a collection of short stories, or?
I suppose I might, because I'm happy with the ones I have that I think are good. But they're very hard for me. And even when I have a successful story, one of the most common comments I get is, this would make a great novel. I tend to write pretty long short stories. My short stories are about 25 pages, most of them. And they're kind of similar in that I do often like to have different scenes and backstory and things weaving together.
Right.
So the novel kind of feels more natural to me. You know, you asked earlier if I knew I wanted to be a writer.
Right.
And I wrote a lot of stories, but, you know, I wrote the novel in, you know, high school that no one is ever going to get to see, although, you know,
Right.
sometimes I look at it and say, okay, for a 16-year-old, you know.
Not bad.
And, you know, people ask me, well, you wrote something different. Well, the one I wrote in high school was sort of the, you know, main character was a Bosnian war survivor, because I was just, you know, that foreign service thing, very interested in
Right.
it. And that actually eventually did turn into one of the short stories I published. But it always felt like a more natural form for me. And it wasn't until I took a writing class in college and they said, you have to turn a short story in on this day, that I actually wrote a short story. And that's interesting because of my writing friends who write fiction, it sort of seems like about half the people feel very drawn to either novels or short stories.
Right.
And the other half kind of see them as a progression. And I think that's always an interesting debate at the pub after workshop. But for me, I like the short stories. I think they're a good challenge for me. They help me focus on certain elements of craft, but I love the novel.
So tell us about some of your favorite Western novelists, or short story. I guess you would say Annie Proulx could be both.
Yeah, and she's certainly one of them. You know, I really love her Wyoming stories. And I love the way that you can get one that's just, you know, gripping and devastating in some ways, and then the next one's hilarious, sometimes in a way you feel bad at laughing for, but it still is. I mentioned earlier Kent Myers. I really like his work. His book Twisted Tree, I thought is difficult to say. You know, it's a novel, but its form is very, it's quite unique, and feels in some places like the chapters could be standalone stories. I like Mark Spragg quite a bit. Kent Huruf, certainly, who I had not read before grad school, and I think one of my mentors there, Lori Lynn Drummond, is probably loving the fact that some of those comparisons have come up in reviews, because she was just like, you need to read Kent Huruf, you need to read Plain Song. So those are certainly some of my favorites.
Were you afraid to read fiction while you were working on this because of the kind of unconscious borrowing of voice?
I don't really feel like that's a problem for me. I know it is for a lot of people, and I have friends who feel that way. My problem with reading fiction while I'm writing fiction is that if it's good and I'm inspired by it, I get through about a paragraph and then I want to go write. And so I never get to a book. So what I often do when I'm actively writing is I reread. So it is okay if I skip around a little bit or I put it down. But I also, you know, I love nonfiction. I love research. I mean, I like writing about things that are kind of far from my own life. So that's a lot of the reading I do while writing is always kind of research-based in some form or another.
So I'm thinking of some of the older writers, older Western writers, Wallace Stegner, people that we think about who kind of defined the West in a way. Are there writers like that you feel defined the kind of Western genre?
You know, one who, for me, is very influential, maybe not necessarily exclusively as a Western writer, is Willa Cather, just because of the way she was able to write about place was very inspiring to me. Just very evocative, and, you know, a lot of the places she's writing about were not places that I had ever been, particularly at the time I was reading them, and felt very much like I was there. And I think the other connection there for me personally is just her love of music and writing about music. And to see someone who was able to do kind of both of those things together and have stories that could be fairly quiet and still have just such dynamic characters,
right.
and
an
you
emotional
feel very
punch.
Compelled to keep reading. And so that's someone who I read quite a lot of myself, even though, you know, you could quibble about whether she qualifies as a Western writer, you know, depending on where we're at. But
when I was reading this book and the part about music in Black River that plays such an important part in Wes's life, I thought of Pa in the Little House books.
Oh.
And how, you know, it was the fiddle and Pa playing the fiddle that Laura and Mary and Grace and Carrie remembered so much about, that kind of in a way made their life bearable. Were you a fan of those books when you were little?
You know, this is one of my embarrassing stories as a kid, is I had the beautiful boxed set of all of them, and I don't think I ever got through even the first one. Not because I didn't like them, I just never even read them, and so I do sometimes feel like I've sort of missed this cultural milestone, especially for, you know, girls who love to read.
Right, right, and that whole sort of westward, well, it's not too late.
Well, that's absolutely true.
I mean, you know, it wouldn't take you long.
I know.
They're a little out of their time, you know, out of their, you're a little the wrong demographic at this point.
Well, you know, is there such a thing?
Yeah, right. One hopes not,
any
doesn't one?
excuse. I mean,
right,
come on.
Right. Do you think, are you going to have a lot about music in your new novel?
I don't think so at this point. I didn't really necessarily expect this book to kind of become so much about music. It was, you know, I knew it almost became I needed something that had been sustaining this, you know, my protagonist Wes, and that he lost. And one of the things I'm very interested in is music. I'm kind of one of those people who loves music but doesn't feel very musical herself. And that's why it's so funny that as I was writing it, I ended up learning to play the fiddle. I'd played viola as a kid badly. It was not anything anyone really wanted to hear. And so I had been listening to a lot of music. I didn't know a lot about old time and bluegrass. I knew I was interested in it. I liked what I'd heard, but I didn't know a lot. And so I was doing all this reading and listening. And at some point the thought kind of came in my head, like, oh, just, you know, maybe go talk to a fiddler. And then it was like, well, maybe, you know, in order to have a pretense to talk to the fiddler, take a few lessons.
Right.
And that pretty quickly became, you know, here's your new fiddle, Sarah, and now you're playing kind of a lot. And I still play, and I found that the learning by ear and the sort of accessibility of folk music was a really good fit for me, partly because you don't have to be that good to play, you know, dance music, which is essentially what most of it is for the old time.
I mean, it's folk music for the folk.
Exactly.
They're not gonna demand perfection.
Yeah, and so that's a nice thing, and the learning by ear worked well for me. So, and that just made it kind of become a bigger and bigger part of the book. It was a wonderful situation because I found that writing kind of made me want to play the fiddle, and if I practiced my fiddle, it inspired me to write when sometimes it was one of those days where I wasn't really in the mood, so it was a perfect match. So I don't know if I'll find anything similar for my next book or not.
Well, Sarah, you've written a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful first novel. Black River is just terrific, and I hope it gets that you get all of the success that's certainly due to you for writing this book. So I will say goodbye to you as SM Hulse, author of Black River. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.